Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 32. Have you anything to tell me today, Shin? The two men in black and gray mottled clothing were prostrate on the ground, watching the activity far below them. No one could see them or their spyglasses watching the soldiers, since they were well above the boulder line. But they both sucked in their breath in surprise as a swarm of soldiers, several hundred, began to march into the forest. Most seemed to hesitate as they entered the trees, but a few strode bravely through, and finally, after an hour of nervously picking their ways up through the slope through the now dead forest, they reached the rock. And that's as far as they went, the massive boulder field, where tons of rock as large as houses rested on top of each other for hundreds of paces up the mountain. And there the soldiers stood, with their hands on their waists and pointing at areas, as if one narrow crevice might be more inviting than another. The two men in black and gray clothing held their breath as they watched. None of the soldiers tried to actually climb the boulders. That would have been too daring, especially after their march into the terrifying forest, but instead poked sticks experimentally into gaps, hoping a critter wouldn't poke back. One of the watching men looked at his companion. The second man nodded. The first man slid backward on his belly into a small ravine, then jogged silently up the canyon to his waiting horse, mounted, and rode fast up the canyon. Pass the time, pass the time. Private Shin needed to pass the time efficiently, carefully, and remain in complete control. He could not, would not be reduced to tears and panic. He was greater and stronger than that. It was his will against Lemuel Thorn's, and Thorn was not about to win this round. After Shin had recovered from his little temper tantrum, he decided his loud response was partially in shock to his new situation. He was still angry, but now he had a plan. Already he was writing this chapter in his head, the chapter for his book on how he overcame the desperate general, who was so gullible as to believe that he was Shin's father, the weak, crippled man whom no one ever dared oppose, but who Perrin Shin the Younger would bring to an ultimate shame. The insipid man who was so sure he was the greatest thing to walk in the world, who in a flash could knock down any man with the force of his slap. He would eventually feel the same humiliation and anger every other man under him felt. And everyone in the world would witness his downfall, and they would cheer it. They would cheer the man who destroyed Lemuel Thorn. The world would again chant General Shin, and he would lead this world the way it should be led. His time in the dungeon would become a most compelling chapter in his book. It wasn't the end, far from it. It was only a turning point. Being perfectly obedient didn't do him any good, but it would give him time to think and plan. But he had to find a way to keep track of the time. The 4 days in incarceration was bad enough when he could see the faint light in the bars, but there was no light here whatsoever. It had only been a few hours, but already his chest tightened several times in fits of anxiety, which didn't help his injured ribs. He started to write his book, laying it out chapter by chapter in his head, but often found his mind rushing through it. He needed to slow it down, to occupy himself between the times he composed his grievances and vengeance. He tried reciting things, figuring out how long it would take to say something, then how often he'd have to repeat it to equal 5 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. He couldn't remember many passages from the writings, only the shortest ones. He estimated how many times he would need to recite those to equal 1 hour, probably about 10 times. He could do that 3 times a day. Then he started to think of songs. His mother had dozens of songs, and he tried to catalog as many as he could, then estimate how long it would take to sing each of them. If he quietly whispered them, they went slower, about an hour 15 minutes worth, he guessed, to get through all of Lilla Travado Shin's repertoire. He could spend about 7 hours that way, reciting passages and singing songs. The rest of his time he could devote to composing and revising his memoirs. Suddenly he heard a noise from above. The planking was being moved away and a lantern appeared. The rope was shifted and the lower half of the ladder descended to the ground. He stood up. A moment later, Sergeant Major Healy started down the ladder, a lantern handle gripped between his teeth. He reached the bottom and set the lantern down. "I'll be right back with your meal for the day," he told the private. "Don't try anything stupid. The guards are watching and you have nowhere to go." "I know that, sir." Healy went back up the ladder while Shin stared at the lantern, grateful for the light. He tried to memorize the flickering of the candle in the brief moments that Healy was gone. Soon he came back down, the handle of a small bucket in his teeth. He dropped to the ground and nodded up to the hole in the ceiling. "I'm down. I'll let you know when I'm ready to come back up." Unseen soldiers pulled up the ladder and slid a few boards back into place. That seemed completely unnecessary. Shin couldn't help himself. His defiant demeanor crumbled, and he began to tremble. "Thank you for coming, sir. I want you to know how sorry I am for deceiving you, but—" "Hush!" Healy whispered. "Be careful. I've told Thorne I'd repeat to him everything you say, so don't say anything incriminating. Once he has what he wants from you, he may not want you anymore." "I understand." Healy cleared his throat and said in a normal tone, "Here's your meal. You get only one a day. If you choose to talk, you'll get more. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Shin responded meekly. Healy handed him the bucket, which held a small piece of bread. Shin closed his eyes. He'd be dead in days. "Now," Healy said in a commanding voice, "begging and pleading for more will do you no good. Best be grateful you're still alive and ask for nothing else, unless you're willing to give us something more." As he spoke, Healy unbuttoned his jacket and reached into a deep inside pocket. Astonishingly, he pulled out a chunk of salted pork and slipped it into Shin's hand. Incredulous, the private began to smile. Healy reached into another inside pocket and pulled out a handful of dried fruits, then another pocket to retrieve a handful of shelled nuts and place them all in Shin's other hand. Then he topped it off with another piece of bread, much thicker and larger than what was in the bucket, from his undershirt pocket. "You need to realize that the more you reveal to us, the better you eat." "I understand, sir," Shin said, smiling broadly in relief. "Good. You will also receive just this mug of water," he said, showing it to him in the bucket. He placed it on the ground since the private's hands were already full. "But you can have much more if you give us what we need." Healy winced apologetically as he unbuttoned his trousers and reached inside to pull out a long, narrow metal flask, topped with a cork. Shin grinned. It was the kind of thigh flask he'd seen many soldiers use to smuggle mead into the barracks. Healy slipped the narrow flask into the gap between the timbers, concealing it completely. "Each day," he said in a loud voice again as he began to take off his jacket, "I will bring you your rations. I will come at the same time every day." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "Just after dinner time." Then he raised his voice again as he slid something long and dark out from the inside of the jacket sleeves. "So that you can be prepared to present to me what I need." Healy produced a piece of cloth that had been tightly bound into narrow folds. He undid the strings holding it together and unfurled a large dirt-brown wool blanket that would help stave off the cool of the dungeon. Shin closed his eyes and a tear slid down his cheek. Healy patted his arm, and Shin opened his eyes. Healy motioned to a gap between the timbers and acted out how to stash the blanket there to hide it. Shin nodded. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice trembling with gratitude as he slipped the extra rations into the gap, followed by the blanket. "Good. Have you anything to tell me today, Shin?" Healy said as he buttoned up his uniform. The private now realized why the sergeant major had the guards replace the floorboards, so they couldn't see the master smuggler at work. Do you realize what showing us the way to Salem will do for you? For the world? You can save everyone and everything if you cooperate." Shin stood tall. "Yes, I do realize that. And I have nothing more to say." Healy nodded. "Then I have nothing more to give you. Drink your water. I need that mug back. Guards," he shouted upward, his voice appropriately stern, "I'm ready to leave." The floorboards moved again, and the ladder began to lower. "Sir," Shin whispered between gulps from the meager mug, "thank you." Healy flashed a grin. "Thank Colonel Shin," he whispered. He slipped the handle of the empty bucket over his arm, secured the lantern handle between his teeth, and started back up the ladder. Shin watched him and the light go up the hole. They vanished and the boards were replaced. But still he managed to smile. Every day Healy would come at the same time, with enough food to sustain him. All he had to do was make it to dinner time each day. That he had ever thought poorly of the sergeant major filled him with regret. He slid down the wall of the pit and sat on the ground again, slipped the blanket and food out of the gap, and felt in the crevice and dirt for every last nut and shriveled grape. He spread the blanket over his cold legs and laid out the food in a triangle on top of it, remembering where he placed each item, so he wouldn't lose a morsel of it in the dark. If he ate slowly, very slowly, he could convince himself that it was a much larger amount, and it could take him over an hour to eat it. He could even save some of it for the morning, whenever that seemed to be. He leisurely chewed on the small piece of bread and thought about what Healy said. Thank Colonel Shin. Nibbling on the fruit and nuts, alternating with his book writing, recitations, and whispers of his mother's songs, maybe, just maybe, he might make it through the next 10 days. The messenger knocked tentatively on Guide Zenas' door. He might not hear that. The 5-year-old sitting on the front porch told him, "Go ahead, bang on it." The messenger smiled down at the boy, who was sorting rocks. "I don't want to be rude," he explained. "Maybe if you could go get him?" "Banging isn't rude. This is rude. Hey!" he shouted as loud as his lungs would let him. "Grandpa Shem, get out here. Someone wants to talk to you." Yes, that's rude. The door flung open to reveal Guide Zenas' 18-year-old daughter. "Finnick, what has your mama said about shouting?" "That it's rude, Aunt Esther. I was just showing him." "You don't have to show him what's rude." Esther looked at the messenger. "Sorry about that. Please come in." The messenger stepped into the house after her. Guide Zenas came out of the eating room, chuckling. "I hear you met my grandson. We call him Mr. Manners. Takes after his great-grandfather. At least that's my excuse for him." He shook the messenger's hand. "Come with me to my office." A minute later, the two men sat down in Guide Zenas' office. The messenger hesitated to speak. Shem smiled. "They've entered the forest, haven't they?" The messenger's eyebrows went up. Yes. 2 scouts watching the fort saw them head straight through the trees." "And they stopped at the boulders?" The messenger nodded. "Seemed to be looking for a path." "And you're afraid to tell me that because—" Squirming, the messenger said, "If they're looking for a path, then that means someone told them that there are or were paths through the boulder field." Shem leaned forward and clasped his hands in front of him. "So, you've come to tell me, instead of Rector Shin, to whom such information should be revealed first, since he's in charge of the security of Salem. Why me, then?" The messenger looked down at his hands. "Very few people in the world know about the paths, Guide. The guards on duty at the glacial fort suggested that I tell you first. They were concerned that, well, that the army learned about the route to Salem from young Perrin Shin, and that might come as quite a shock to Rector Shin." Shem nodded. "Except that we have no evidence young Perrin Shin revealed such information, do we?" Did they have a spyglass to see who was at the head of the soldiers? The messenger nodded. They didn't see him, but I'm to bring back additional glasses on my return. They'll be looking for him specifically. They won't find him, the guide declared. I'm confident someone else revealed the roots. I know of at least 3 other people in the world with that knowledge, each with a connection to Lemuel Thorne, his daughter, his son-in-law, and his mistress. Don't be afraid of telling Rector Shin. But, he leaned closer, tell no one else. Not until they clear the boulder field do I want anyone in Salem to begin to worry. This still could take several days, even weeks. And, he beckoned the messenger even closer, whatever you do, do not say anything to Mari Shin. She'll be sure to think the last day is coming tomorrow. The private was pretty sure it was only morning. That's why he was surprised to hear the floorboards moving above him. In a panic, he shoved the blanket into the gap and was grateful he'd hid the last of the crumbs there last night. He brushed himself off quickly in case he missed something. Standing up, he looked toward the ladder that began to descend and held his breath in anticipation. When he heard the voice that was trying to find a way to get down the ladder, he cringed. Amory. He stood against the wall as first a soldier came down, holding a lantern. As he reached the ground, he scowled and set down the lantern against the opposite wall. Next came Amory, wearing a ridiculously full skirt and tiny silk shoes. "What is that smell?" she muttered as she struggled down the ladder. "That's just so revolting. And they say it's going to get worse?" She reached the bottom, turned, and looked at Shin. He glared back at her. "Leave us. I'll call up when I'm ready." The guard scoffed. "I heard you're always ready." Amory stepped up to him, since there really wasn't any place else to go in the cramped dungeon. "Do you have any idea who I am, who I will be? You watch that mouth of yours, or you'll find yourself as his companion." The guard paled. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll be just right up there." And he quickly climbed away. Shin stared at the lantern, trying to absorb its light and pretending it was the sun. But Amory was watching the guard until he went through the ceiling and replaced the boards. She finally looked at Shin. "This is a terrible situation. I'm so sorry." Reluctantly, he turned from the light to her. She was so haggard and overly painted that she appeared to be 60 years old. "No, you're not," he said coldly. "I'd guess you've never been sorry about anything, ever." Amory shifted. "I realize you haven't heard, but I have a new position. I'm to ride with Lemuel to Salem as his queen." "His queen? What are you talking about?" "Lemuel's going to take Salem," she said smugly. "He's going to unite it with the world to create the largest kingdom this world has ever witnessed. And my reward for presenting it to him? I will rule right beside him." Shin scoffed. "Ugh, Thorne will never share his rule with you. He shares nothing. He only takes and uses, then throws away." She tipped her head confidently. "Not this time. This time I hold all the silver chips. I even have a few more, and he knows it." "And do you think you can win? He always has one more. He'll let you think you're controlling the game until the last moment." She took a step closer and covered her nose with a lacy handkerchief as the smell of the pit overwhelmed her. Through her hand she said, "I know far too much about Salem. I'm too valuable to him, and he knows I'm the only one you will talk to. You can fill in the details I don't have. Pear, I don't want to see you like this, I promise." Her eyes wandered all over his underdressed body and lingered on his bare shoulders. "I thought he'd incarcerate you or something, but this? Well, I just never expected." "What are you trying to do?" he exhaled in exasperation. "It won't work. I'm on to you. You've ruined me too many times." "I ruined you?" she exclaimed, her widely painted eyebrows flying upward. "I saved your life yesterday when Thorn was about to kill you." "You're the one who exposed me to him in the first place," he reminded hotly. "Well, what about you ousting me from the mansion, which, I will have you know, I have recently moved back into?" She jabbed him in the chest. "Do you know how I had to live for the past few seasons?" It was fortunate for her that Shin was chained to the wall, but she was still within grasping range. He fought the overwhelming urge to strangle her. You stole my pack! That first night, I got you down into the world and then you robbed me?" Amory licked her lips, seeming almost contrite. "I couldn't risk you ruining my chances. I didn't know what you were up to, if you'd destroy everything before I got my chance to enjoy it. Plus, I knew you had those slips of silver and gold we stole from the glacial fort. I had to buy new clothing if I was going to catch me an officer." Then why didn't you just take some of my silver and leave me the pack?" Amory shrugged lazily. "I was going to return it. Then I met someone and just forgot." Shin rolled his eyes. "Just forgot? Amory, you don't just forget you robbed someone who helped you. You know, I actually felt bad about having you kicked out of the mansion. Felt just a little guilty watching you become the village sow. But now," he scoffed a laugh, "you deserved it. You got exactly what you had coming." He knew she was going to slap him. As soon as he called her a sow, he could see it building in her eyes, but he didn't care. Every part of his body was already aching. Adding his face to it wouldn't make much difference. He leaned back as her hand rose up so that she didn't connect as forcefully as she wanted. "And to think I came here to tell you I was sorry," she spat. "Of course you were." "I was, seeing you standing there, chained like a mad dog." Her chest began to heave, and she licked her lips. He could tell she was trying to entice him, but she only disgusted him. For once, he felt nothing for her. He realized he was finally seeing her for what she was. Shameless, scheming, and desperate. And ugly. All the face paint in the world, and it looked like she was wearing half the world's supply, couldn't cover what she really was. "I could help you get out, Pear," she said in a sultry voice that nauseated him more than the maggots in the corner chewing on a decaying piece of something. "I have more influence and power than ever before. Whatever I want, Lemuel does." She took another step closer to him. He stepped back against the timbers of the dungeon. She placed a hand on his chest and slowly let it slide down. His upper lip curled. She was so predictable, so common. "I don't remember how to decipher the codes on the trees and the rocks, Pear, but if you help me, I can help you." Her hand continued to slide. "No one can find the route through the boulder field, the one for horses that goes to the first resting station. They've been looking all day yesterday and this morning, but you could tell me how to find it again." Her filthy hand kept moving. In a flash, he caught her by the wrist and twisted her arm. She cried out in pain and collapsed to her knees, her fluffy skirt sinking into the muck. "Get away from me, you old sow!" Shin hollered. "You're so eager to betray Salem, to destroy our families and all they've created. For what? For the title of queen? Then go be queen. I'd rather rot here than ever be touched by you." He shoved her away. Amory stumbled backward, her hands flying behind her to stop her fall on the filthy ground. Immediately she scrambled to her feet, staring at the muddy sop on her palms and nearly retching at it. Snatching her handkerchief, she frantically tried to wipe her hands. "You'll regret that, Shin," she hissed as she backed to the other side of the dungeon. "Your whole family will regret this. You think they'll be spared? Oh, no, they won't. I will lead him to them. I'll watch him kill your parents and your grandmother and take your sisters and brothers and cousins. Lemuel can be very cruel, Shin. When someone sets him off just right, he's a ravenous animal. He hates you now, hates the memory of your family and the way they keep popping up and making a mess of his plans. Always there's a Shin to get in his way. That's what he said last night. Always Shins interfering. He may still have feelings for Jatesy, but the rest of your family, reminders of his failings. He'd have a lot fewer failures, Shin intoned, if he'd quit doing stupid and wrong things. There's no such thing as right or wrong, Amory said flippantly. Only people who don't know how to take advantage of power. But Lemuel does, and he will. He'll march into Salem and claim all of it for his own, then wipe out the last of the Shins who have always haunted him. That didn't sound quite right. Amory, listen, this makes no sense. He admired my grandfather, yet wants to destroy his family. He was thrilled to think I was his son, that I share his blood and the Shin's blood, but now he wants to wipe it out. Think about this. Lemuel has created so many lies that he no longer remembers the truth. He doesn't even know what he really wants. He just runs after one impulse into another. She stood taller. Which is why he's such a brilliant leader. Which is why he's seriously unstable, Shin insisted. He can't keep it all straight. It's all going to fall apart, and you'll go down with him. Something worrying flickered in her eyes, as if that thought had occurred to her before, but she shoved it away. After all, Lemuel was the one with the power, and you have to align yourself with whoever has the power. He'll succeed, she declared. He'll take over everything and even rid himself of the burden of Shins. He scowled. Burden? What are you talking about? But she plowed on, as if everything was already settled. Then I'll come back here to your little dungeon home and give you a full description of how your family suffered under his hands because you wouldn't help us. Discovering houses full of Shins he can torture and ravage will give him immense pleasure. We don't need you, Pear. We can find Salem ourselves. It's not that hard, you know. I was just trying to help you. But now, you've just destroyed your whole family. Then you really will be the last Shin alive. Shin's hands clenched into fists as he calculated how far he could lunge before being yanked back by the chain. He could get her, he was sure. He could strangle that skinny little throat and rid the world of the most repugnant woman who ever lived. Instead, he felt something hold him back, with the idea that her end was coming soon enough, and not by his hand. Shin spat in her face. "Get out of my dungeon, sow!" he bellowed. "Guards, Queen Amory is ready to leave, and she won't be coming back." 2 minutes later, Shin, still seething in fury, watched as the last floorboard was slipped into place and his world was plunged back into darkness. Tears of frustration and anger slid down his face. "Why didn't I kill her?" he whimpered. He lunged in fury, only to be yanked back by the chains like an old guard dog. "Why didn't I just grab her and kill her? She will lead them to the estates. He'll kill them all. He won't even think of what he's doing. But just like Lick and Onus and Varys, he'll just have them all wiped out as fast as he can." He slumped to the ground and held his head, tears tracking down his face. "She's right. They'll all die because of me. No, why didn't I kill her?" "Because I told you not to." Shin's head snapped up, and he stared into the darkness, half hoping he'd hear the words again, half hoping he wouldn't. "Because you don't need to add murderer to the list of crimes Lemuel is compiling against you." "Pugga? Young Pear? Finally!" Shin was unsure if he should respond to the voice. On the one hand, it was his fault he was in here. On the other, the next days could go a lot faster with some company, and maybe he could do something about Amory. Yes, Pugga, I hear you. He was desperate enough even to talk to him. Where have you been? Here. Young pair, you blocked me out again. Shin sighed. That was probably true. And probably time he stopped doing that. Well, what do you think of my new home? Impressed? Young pair, you've gone to some depths before, but I have to say this is rather impressive. Shin chuckled mirthlessly. You really think I've missed your sarcasm, old man? Oh, I'm not being sarcastic. This really is deeply impressive. Shin rested his head against the wood timbers behind him. Pugga, you heard her, right, Amory? She's going to lead Lemuel to them. We have to find a way to stop her. Don't worry, young pair. She won't succeed. And you were right about Lemuel not letting her win at his game. Have you been playing dices while I wasn't looking? Shin smiled faintly. No, Pugga, but I've learned about it anyway. Lemuel will let Amory think she's winning until the last moment. She will never set foot in Salem, young pair. And the family is safe. They're prepared. Everyone in Salem is. He sighed in relief. Oh, are you sure? Who's in charge of security now? Your father. Who else could it be? Is that a good idea, old man? It's an excellent idea. It's the Creator's idea. Pato listens to him, as does Shem, and because of that, Salem will remain safe. If you think so. I know so. But then again, I guess if Salem is safe, that goes contrary to your plans, doesn't it? Shin groaned softly. And you must admit, your plans aren't always the best. Shin drummed his fingers on his leg. My plans are fine, except when others meddle when they shouldn't. Do you remember what you just said about Lemuel? That he'd have a lot fewer failures if he'd quit doing stupid and wrong things? Shin rolled his eyes, but said, Fair point, like father, like son? Oh, don't say such things. No, I thought you were referring to Poe's meddling. I noticed he still has his smuggling skills well intact. Clever man. I like the trick with the blanket. I was talking about you. It's your fault I was incarcerated. My fault. I wasn't the one who sent you on that foolhardy trip to the West. You never would have made it, either. You don't know that. Yes, I do. I know everything. If you really know everything, and it wasn't your fault, then what did I do wrong that day? First, you woke up. Then it went all downhill from there. Shin scoffed. Figured you'd say that. I'm sorry, young pair. I wouldn't have said that at the time, you know. I could have helped you during those terrible days in that cell. It broke my heart to watch you. You were there? I'm always here. I never move away from you. It's you who moves away from me. But you came through it well. I'm proud of you. Your more humble attitude has helped you survive the last several days. And look where it got me, he exclaimed. I was perfect, just like you told me to be. A lot of good that did. He rattled the chain around his wrist and ankle. It kept you alive. Healy wouldn't have defended you if you hadn't been perfect. And I couldn't be prouder of you now. You're here because of your bravery. My what? Young pair, Lemuel's presence terrifies people into saying and doing things they wouldn't normally do. But you didn't give in. You preferred to die. I know you thought you were a coward as you lay on the floor, but I have never seen a braver man than you at that moment. You were willing to die. Remarkable. A smile began to form around Shin's mouth. Really? Really. In fact, when Lemuel demanded to know your name and you said, Perrin Shin, I shouted, yes, that's my boy. I'm rather surprised no one heard me." Shin grinned. "Thank you, Pugga. I was hoping you'd be there if I died." "I know. I'll always be here. A small part of me is disappointed I couldn't embrace you then. But that day will come soon enough, young pair." Those words worried him. "Pugga, what's going to happen to me in 9 days?" "Depends on what you're going to do." "I won't tell them about Salem, Pugga." "I know you won't. You've already proved that. And I like to believe that you didn't reveal Salem, not because you're waiting to keep it hidden until you are ready to lead that new kingdom, but because you wanted to keep Salem safe." "When Thorn was kicking me, I wasn't even thinking about my future. I was thinking about little Mora." "She thinks a lot about you, too." "I'm sorry to confess I haven't thought that much about her," he said. "But suddenly I pictured her as me, with Thorn kicking her little body. I couldn't let that happen, Pugga. But I fear that somehow I already have." "You've done nothing to compromise Salem's security. Others have done that. You don't have to have the guilt of revealing Salem on your conscience." "But I brought Amory here." "True, but she wasn't the first person to tell Thorn about Salem. He'd been hearing rumors about it for years. And you should also know it wasn't Amory who saved you from Lemuel's sword. He was suddenly struck with the idea that it would be far more satisfying to keep you locked up than to kill you." Wait a minute. So I have you to thank for my new dungeon home?" "Better than the alternative, right?" Shin scoffed into the darkness. "Ugh, I don't know, Pugga. I really don't. I feel like I'm in a coffin. Is this what it felt like?" "I don't know. I was never in that box. I was standing next to my son when they were closing it up. Then I sat by my wife and daughter as you threw in the dirt. That was only my body. I kept going. And you need to keep going. There's still work for you to do, young pair. Yesterday, for the first time, you showed your willingness to be a true Salemite. We need to get you back there to do so." "So I'll survive this?" "Yes, young pair. If you're careful, you can survive this. But realize that a lot of how you described Thorn to Amory could also apply to you. Not sure of what you want anymore? Acting impulsively? Even some self-deception as to what will work and what won't?" He scratched his chin guiltily. "Yeah, I kind of have to agree that sometimes I'm a little like him." "Well, he'll just take it as a sign that you're really his son, that you're as stupid as he is sometimes." He scoffed. "Ugh, thank you for that." "I meant it with love, you know that. Now, be very careful in the next few days, and we can get you through this. Poe will take care of you, but you have to help him out too, all right?" Suddenly, Healy's last words yesterday made sense. "Pugga, have you been speaking to Sergeant Major Healy?" "In a manner of speaking, yes. He was always a good boy, just never had the right influences in his life. But we go way back, Poe and I. Did you know it was your grandmother who first started calling him Poe? She thought Qualipo was far too big a name for a little 6-year-old boy. I imagine even he's forgotten she's the one who gave him his nickname." Shin smiled into the darkness. "Tell me more stories, Pugga. Tell me more about the people here, about people in Salem. Tell me everything you know." "Everything?" "Yes, everything. One thing I have right now, Pugga, is plenty of time. Tell me about Poe watching you train the soldiers. When I signed up, he said you taught him how to hold a sword." He heard a cosmic chuckle. "Well, it was actually a stick when he was 9 years old, and he was pretty worried about snagging his silk shirt." "Poe Healy? In silk?" "Yes, but if you knew his mother, it wasn't such a surprise. That woman, Phew, she was something else. The ceiling above Shin began to shift, and he struggled to get to his feet, shoving the blanket into the crevice behind him. Remember what I told you? Shin nodded. A lantern above his head appeared and slowly made its way down the ladder. Po Healy nodded a greeting as he reached the bottom, and Shin smiled back. Healy put the lantern down, went back up, and came back a moment later with the bucket. "Pull up the ladder," he called when he was safely down, and a moment later the floorboards slid back into place. "How are you doing?" Healy whispered to Shin. "A little lonely and hungry, but I'm all right," he whispered back. Healy patted him comfortingly on the shoulder. In a loud, harsh voice, he said, "Do you finally realize the seriousness of your situation, Shin?" "Feed me first, sir. I'm so weak. Water, please." "Just a sip. Then give me something that I need." Healy handed him the mug out of the bucket, then placed the bucket on the ground with the ration of bread. He unbuttoned his jacket and again produced a variety of foods from concealed pockets. "Is there no more, sir?" Shin asked in a sufficiently pitiful voice. Healy smirked. "Do you have something more for me?" Shin nodded. Cocking his head in surprise, Healy whispered, "Be careful." "I will be," he whispered back. Louder, for the benefit of the soldiers listening above, he said, "Sir, Miss Amory was here earlier, wanting to know how to read the markings, but there are no markings on this side. There are signs of how to get into the world, but none how to get back. The soldiers will never find any markings on any rocks or trees. Thorn can stare all he wants at the rocks, but they'll never reveal the horse trail, just like I won't." "Perfect," Healy whispered, as he pulled out another long flask full of water from his trousers. Shin took his empty one from the gap, and they traded them in silence. "So," Healy said loudly, "you really think that's what I want to hear, that the markings aren't there? If you want more water, you'll have to do better than that. No additional water until you reveal what you know. Amory told us you marked the trees to show a way back, but what we need are the markings for the rock paths. She told us there were at least 4 of them. Where are they?" "I told you. I've got nothing more to say to you, Sergeant Major." "Then I've got nothing more to give you." He glanced around to make sure his uniform was buttoned properly before calling, "Ladder!" "Sir, please, no." "Maybe tomorrow you'll have something useful," Healy announced. In a tone designed to sound like a concerned superior officer, he continued, "Look, I want to help you, Shin, I really do," he said, as the floorboards moved and the ladder began to slide back down. He glanced up at the guards and held up a finger. "Look, Shin," he said, just loud enough for them to hear. "I hate seeing you like this, but my hands are tied until you give me something more, until you cooperate. Come on, Shin." Shin's chin trembled as he covered his face with his hands, because a convincing performance was required for the spying soldiers above. "I can't, sir. I can't betray my people." "It's not betrayal, Shin," Healy exclaimed, gripping his shoulder in a dramatic manner. The sergeant major had some acting abilities as well. "It's salvation. They can save us, we can save them. They must be suffering too. Each of us can help each other, but the only way we can do it is if you help us. You, Shin, are the key to saving the world. Don't you want to save the world? Thorn will forgive you if you help us. He misses you, but he has to be the general first, your father last. You understand, don't you? Just tell me, how do we get the horses through?" Shin shook his head. I can't. "Good," Healy whispered hurriedly. "Don't. It's enough for now." In a louder voice he said, "Maybe tomorrow? I'll bring extra water, but you have to give me something extra too." He picked up the lantern and the bucket and went back up the ladder. When the dungeon was dark again, Shin whispered into it, "How is that?" You know, watching you this past year and a half has made me think about the many times you apologized and cried in front of me. Were you faking all of those times as well?" Shin pulled out the thick piece of jerky Poe gave him. "Consider it practice for my time here. If I didn't have you to learn on, I might be dead by now." "Oh, young pair, young pair." "Not every time was an act, Pugga. There were many incidents I sincerely regretted." "How about jumping off the school roof?" "Did I apologize for that one?" "No, I don't remember that you did." "Can I apologize for it now?" "Will you mean it?" "Mostly. I'm sorry you had to get help to carry me back because you weren't strong enough by yourself." "Eat your jerky." Healy jogged up the stairs to the command tower and made his way to the large desk, pulled out a paper and quill, and wrote as fast as he could. Twig, standing in the doorway, watched him until he was finished. "Did he talk?" "And he'll talk more in time. He's terrified down there. The guards say they've heard him mumbling all day as if he's having a conversation. But I think he's too hungry. We have to increase the rations, or he'll become delirious and make no sense at all." "Maybe," Twig said. "Thorn's due back from the boulder field. Tell him." Thorn, shouting a few minutes later, announced his presence. "Then they're not looking hard enough. There are crevices everywhere. Tell them to start climbing into them. I don't care if they're worried about getting lost. They should be more worried about me losing patience. Tie a long rope to a tree, then have them crawl in with it. They can crawl back out following the rope. Do I have to come up with a solution to everything? Healy, what did he say?" The sergeant major handed him his notes. "We made some progress today, sir. He claims there were never any markings on how to get out of the world, only on how to get in. I just finished writing down our conversation." Thorn read through it quickly, sniggering at the end. "So he'll reveal nothing? Like he won't reveal they never marked the way through the boulder fields? Stupid boy. He just verified there are paths through the boulders and one for horses. Good work, Healy." "Thank you, sir. I was thinking Shin is a large man, and what we're feeding him isn't nearly enough." "That's the point, Healy. Starve them into talking," he said, holding up the evidence. "But there's a new concern, sir. The guards heard him mumbling all afternoon, as if he was in conversation with someone there. If he becomes too weak, he may become delusional and not give us anything worthwhile. I think it's apparent he knows things, but if we don't control him just right, he'll die before we get what we need." Thorn considered that. "You may have a point, Healy. Give him extra bread, extra water, and a piece of jerky." 3 times a day, sir?" Thorn sighed. "Remember, sir," Healy said carefully, "as soon as he breaks, he might be ready to show us the route. But if he's too weak—" "Twice a day, Healy. We don't want him thinking we're breaking before he does, correct?" "You're right, sir. I did not consider that." "Of course you didn't. That's why I'm the general." "Of course." And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.